Recording all the sessions. They'll end up on our website whenever we can get that back up and running again. Okay, and let's get started. Hopefully everything will work here. If I can get, there we go.
Westinghouse's KDKA, listeners, we share 100 years of KDKA radio.
Climb aboard our magic carpet for a montage of memories. Radio's finest hour.
So if you did remember the last presentation I made, we talked about the technology leading up to KDKA. And so I thought I'd just touch on some of that just to reiterate for some of you who hadn't seen it, okay? And that's where we get started. So how about this guy? Fessenden was quite an interesting individual. He was Canadian born but became a U.S. citizen, worked in radio and sonar, which happens to be something I worked in undersea systems for a good portion of my life, about 20 years. And anyway, he did some groundbreaking work in audio radio transmissions. The interesting thing is he worked for Edison, he worked for Westinghouse, he worked for the U.S. Weather Bureau, and then a company called NESCO, a National Electronic Signal Company. He and his crew went up to, let's see, where was that? Brant Rock, Massachusetts, and started doing some transmission work in audio, okay? Up until this point, radio transmissions were just CW, okay? Morse code. And he put together something. Initially, they had, well, it was interesting. He used a high-speed electric motor, about 50 kilohertz, okay? Alternating current dynamo. And it generated what he called pure sine waves and produced a continuous train of radiant waves, CW. And then he introduced a simple carbon microphone into the transmission line and modulated the carrier, and got AM amplitude modulated signals out of that people could hear on their standard CW radios. And they were like amazed. I hear voices, I hear music, I hear a Bible verse being read over the radio. And these transmissions were heard as far away as, well, this was up in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Supposedly he had this controversial Christmas Eve broadcast. Well, it was in that time of year, around Christmas and New Year's, that he was getting these transmissions off and was heard at ships at sea as far away as Norfolk, Virginia, and the West Indies. Okay? And it was a pretty good start for voice being over radio. Okay? And another person we owe technology to is Lee DeForest. Okay? Now, Lee was an American inventor, and he was the self-proclaimed father of radio, okay? Lee was more of a tinkerer than an engineer, I'm pretty sure about that. But in any case, he developed the Grid Audion, the first actual working amplifier tube, and that was in 1906. And he developed some radios that were audio, and they were installed on the Great White Fleet that circumnavigated the world in 1907 and 1909. And these fellows would pull into a port and they'd start broadcasting audio signals, and people were going, "Wow, we've never heard that before on the radios." Okay, and so we owe Lee some background here as far as getting voice on radios that were based on tubes, okay? And tubes were a whole lot better than these huge dynamotors that we used in the past, okay? Lee also created an arc transmitter, and then some other, finally, that was from 1907 to 1910, he was doing broadcasting. Then the war came. They stopped all that broadcasting, but then after that, he developed a tube-based transmitter and had an experimental license to broadcast from 1916 to 1917, and then 1919 to 1920, he was doing broadcasting. He was doing, but it was all on experimental license, okay? It was very localized in the New York area. And who else do we owe future to? The future of broadcasting, we owe Edwin Armstrong, okay? And lots of people understand that his background was pretty incredible, really. An American electrical engineer and inventor. He developed frequency modulation, FM, that we all use today. He was the developer of the super heterodyne radio. The super heterodyne is still pretty much the principle behind most of radios that operate today. And I'm not going to get into the details there, but he also discovered regeneration late in 1913, and he patented it. And Lee DeForest said, well, I actually developed that first, except that he saw it as a disadvantage and tried to eliminate it, okay? And they went to court, and Edward Armstrong ultimately won that court battle. And this is what won it for him. This diagram from 1912, I think, where he figured out how to use tubes to transmit radio signals, okay, through using the principles of regeneration and oscillation, okay? That was a key to getting tubes to operate as transmission to transmit signals, okay? And so that was key for leading us to the future of KDKA. And these vacuum tube-based oscillators became the ultimate basis for what was the background or the capability of KDKA to be transmitting when they did in 1920. So, given those factors, you say, well, was KDKA the first transmission? Well, actually, there were some others before that. Charles Harrod was an instructor out in San Jose, and he had a school and he ultimately was transmitting on an experimental license broadcast for his students, okay? And you say, well, in 1912, that was like 8 years before KDKA, but it was on an experimental license. It was very limited to his students, okay? Young and McCobb's is at a department store in Rock Island, Illinois, and in under 9BY, okay, their license designation. In 1920, they began weekly concerts, and ultimately 9BY became WOC in 1922. But again, it was very limited. It was under experimental license, and it was only on a weekly basis. And a fellow named Dr. William Reynolds in Colorado Springs was doing nightly concerts on 9JE at Colorado Springs in October of 1920, which was just a little bit before KDKA. And that became KLZ in Denver in 1922, okay? So was KDKA the first radio station to actually be broadcasting? Well, we'll get to that later, okay? But then came World War I. In World War I, all the hams were shut down, okay? No experimental transmissions. Nobody was allowed to transmit at all. The U.S. Navy basically took over the wireless band. Okay, and you got to realize at that time, Marconi, a foreign-owned company, had most of the radio transmissions going on. They were communicating to ships at sea. Remember the Titanic had wireless operators that were from the Marconi organization, and that's how they knew that the ship had hit an iceberg. And they lost a lot of people on the Titanic, but it became a big issue, realizing that most ships needed radios. And but anyway, the Navy shut everything down because they needed it for the war effort. And along came this guy named Frank Conrad, okay? And Frank was an electrical engineer. He started working for Westinghouse in 1890 at the age of 16. Now, he only went to school until he was like 12 or something like that. But he just had a knack for this stuff. And he became interested in radio in 1913. He built an amateur station, which was in the garage of his home in Pittsburgh, and he started under an experimental license 8XK, okay? And in the summer of 1916, he started putting this all together and started doing his own little broadcasts to local folks, playing radios. Playing records. He ran out of records of his own selection, so he went down to the record store and said, "Hey, I'll tell you whose records, where I got these records from if you let me borrow them." And he would play those on his, and folks were starting to really pay attention to what he was doing. And but then World War I came, everything was shut down. But Frank, because of his involvement with Westinghouse and the development of aircraft radios, including, World War I happened. Everything got shut down. But he was developing transmitters for aircraft. This is the SCR-69 aircraft transmitter, and also receivers, the SCR-70. And because of his involvement there, he actually got a special license to keep his ham station operating, and he was communicating back to the Westinghouse facility in downtown Pittsburgh, so that they could check out new technology and stuff like that. So the war ended, and after World War I, Frank started broadcasting again. Okay, got permission to broadcast, still under his old 8XK call sign, and that's the word I was looking for. Okay, call sign. Anyway, and he was playing about 2 hours every Wednesday and Saturday evening. He had, and folks were listening in, and they were having a good time. And he actually ended up as the cover article for the QST in 1920. There's his setup from his home, and so what was happening was kind of interesting. The folks in Pittsburgh were so excited about this that one of the local department stores, Joseph Horn Company, decided that, so many people are listening in on his broadcasts, okay, local broadcasts, that they started selling crystal radios. And that's when the folks at Westinghouse said, you know what? This isn't just about ship-to-ship, shore-to-ship communication or ship-to-ship communication. This might be something bigger than that. And a fellow by the name of Harry Davis came on the scene. Harry was a vice president at Westinghouse. He said, you know what, I think Conrad's onto something here, and we need to promote this. And actually, one of his quotes was, it's a confidential means of communication, and realized that radio was an idea of a limitless opportunity. And so Westinghouse committed themselves to saying, we're going to do something bigger and better than just ham operations. Okay, remember we had the presentation today on chambers, and that was all about amateurs. This was different. This was like getting radios to the general public. And if you wanted to get radios to the general public, you had to have them have something to listen to. Okay, so Harry Davis said, Frank, let's build a transmitter. And they put it on top of the roof of this building here. This is a Westinghouse building K in Pittsburgh. And it was an 8-floor building. And on the roof of the building, they built a shack. And the shack contained the first development, or the first basis for KDKA. And let's see where we go from this. Okay, so they applied for a license. This was unique. They were the first organization to get a commercial license, okay? And the license was a Class 2 limited commercial. KDKA was issued to Westinghouse. That was the call sign. They were limited to 300 to 500 meters, which is 60 to 1,000 kilohertz on which is essentially the broadcast band. They also had a provision for 3,200 meters, which is up in the HF frequency, and you'll see how that plays into things too. They were limited to 200 watts, which isn't a whole lot of power, but and that license was issued to, and here's the various pieces to that license, okay? This one talks about it was issued to Westinghouse and, okay, Cleveland, Ohio, and Springfield, Massachusetts, whatever. KDKA down at the very bottom, okay? Here was the frequencies that was issued on, etc. Okay, I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this. 200 watts limit, and issued on October 27th, 1920, okay? So they had their license, and they said, what are we going to do with this now? Said, what is going to be the big thing that people will want to listen in on? And that was the election, okay? That was coming up in November. So here's here in the background here is the shack that they built on the roof of Building K. And here's the antenna that they streamed between the factory buildings. And they put together KDKA. This was the initial transmitter. It had 4 50-watt output vacuum tubes and a telephone microphone. Okay, they used a microphone from a telephone, and that was what they used. Here's a little description about the transmitter. Things that I already talked about. 1,000 volts on the tubes there to get the output that they needed. And let's see what else we got here. Okay, so they covered the election. This was between Cox and Harding, and here's the original crew. Okay, we've got. Let's see. We could name all the people, but you probably wouldn't recognize their names. They were all Westinghouse employees. Okay, they all worked for Frank Conrad, and they put together this broadcast. It was they tuned into the local radio, local newspapers who had telegraphs to tell them what the election results were all about, and they were broadcasting them through the evening. And so what did it sound like? It sounded something like this.
Anyone hearing
I'm sorry, I cut it off. That's okay. Anyway, bottom line is they went through the election, and that was the first broadcast. Now, I want to point something out. You see between these two fellows on the left here, what do you see there? You see, oh, there's the rest of it. Yeah, that was a replication. Nobody had tape recorders back then, but that's pretty much what they... Okay, so what I wanted to point out here was, you see this little radio right here? There's it blown up a little bit. You see this that they branded me the Historic Meter Award. Okay, this was, guess who developed this? Frank Conrad. Okay, the same fellow who did KDKA, he's the one who patented this radio, along with a fellow named Little that he served with in the during World War I in the Signal Corps. Well, that's how they became friends. And that radio was from 1921, a year after the election. But the reason I got the award was because that's ties right in with this particular presentation. And I thought that was pretty cool. I got that at a Mark auction, and I'm kind of happy about it. Anyway, okay, so next is, okay, who was first? Okay, well, there's a lot of controversy. We talked about that a little bit ago. Who actually had the first radio broadcast? Well, controversy continues, but KDA was the first one to have a broadcast license in a Class 2 limited commercial license, not experimental or amateur license, okay? So that really did put them as the first commercial broadcast. And there were a lot of other things that KDKA has claimed as number one. We'll talk about some of those as we go through here. So that's the only slide that has words on it. So after the initial broadcast, Conrad continued to develop the station. In December 21st, they started. Well, initially, right after the broadcast, they went like semi-weekly. They were broadcasting, and then in December of 21, only a month afterwards, the station started daily scheduled broadcasts, okay? And KDKA is still out there, still broadcasting. Initially, for about an hour each evening, they were online, okay? And then they were gained a reputation as one of the premier broadcasting stations in the nation. And in August of 21, the transmitter was upgraded from 100 to 500 watts, and 2 months later it saw an additional doubling to 1,000 watts. And this is the transmitter as it looked in 1922. Okay, and in July of 21, stepping back a little bit, RCA arranged for. Okay, let me go. Yeah, that's what I wanted. RCA arranged for a broadcast, a live broadcast over a temporary station, WJY, of the Jack Dempsey George Carpenter fight, a boxing match, and that was the first boxing match that was ever broadcast over the radio, and that was in New Jersey. And the company claimed 300,000 people listened in to WJY. KDKA participated in the event by providing supplemental coverage west of WJY. So they rebroadcast the transmission, and this was part of Conrad's scheme. Part of Harry Davis's scheme was not to just have a radio station, but to have a series of radio stations, okay? A true broadcast, okay? Not just one radio station, but radio stations that were interconnected and broadcasting beyond that. And it only took them a short while to get that up and running, okay? What was next? In August of 1921, KDKA became the first radio station to broadcast a Major League professional baseball game. It was a game between the Pittsburgh Pirates and the Philadelphia Phillies, and it was broadcast from Ford's Field. The thing that was interesting was this fella, Harold Arland, actually became the first radio commentator, okay, and he covered the baseball game and became an announcer on KDKA quite routinely. In the fall of that year, hang on a second, I'm getting something organized here. I've lost my notes. Okay, wait a minute. They're coming back. Okay, in the fall of that year, they became the first station to broadcast a college football game, and then in 1922, KDKA hosted this fella, who, for some of you remember him, if I can get it to come. There he is, Will Rogers. The first time Will Rogers got on a radio station was on KDKA, and so, you know, there were a number of firsts that came out of KDKA, and of course Will Rogers was around for a long time, and his political commentaries were rather interesting, okay? So anyway, moving on. So we needed stuff to broadcast now, and KDKA struggled with studios, okay? Initially, they tried to broadcast from a standard studio, and they found out that it sounded terrible, that there was an awful lot of reverberation and stuff like that. It just didn't sound good on the radio. So they moved their performance to a tent outside on the roof of the K building there, and it was very crude and rudimentary until it blew down in a storm one time. And so then they built a studio, and the studio had all these cloth drapes, okay, for acoustic purposes. And they said it was monk cloth, okay. It was really burlap, all right, but they just called it monk cloth because that sounded a lot better than burlap, all right. But that worked great for these studios, and so this was KDKA's first studio that was in the K building, actually. And they finally outgrew that. They moved to a number of different buildings. They were in the Post building in Pittsburgh for a while, and then 2 different hotels, and finally in 1934, they had their own studio on the 3rd floor of the Pittsburgh Grant building. And so things were really hopping for KDKA. And its studios and transmitting power, as it continued to grow, so did their antennas, okay? And this is a ground shot and then also an aerial shot. This was, at one point, this was like the tallest metal structure in the United States, 718 feet tall, and that was in 1938, okay? So stepping through history here, KDKA continued to grow and to advance. And so then taking the concept beyond where it was just one radio station, KDKA at the end of 1921 established stations in 3 additional major metropolitan areas, including WJZ in Newark, New Jersey, and now is WABC in New York City. And originally, there was a WBZ in Springfield, Massachusetts, now in Boston as KYW. KYW was in Chicago, okay, and that's where KYW ended up moving to Philadelphia. Don't ask me why it moved to Philadelphia, but might have been something like why the Colts moved to Indiana or something like that from Baltimore. But in any case, in 1923, KDKA began simultaneous broadcasting on 360 meters. That's an HF frequency. Okay, they would do a broadcast or they would have something going on at KDKA in Pittsburgh, and they would broadcast it by HF radio to these other stations. And so now they were transmitting to all these different and covering the whole East Coast with the same signal. It was just this was the beginning of something really big. Okay. This was the beginning of real broadcasting, not just a single station. I also got to show you, okay, this was the HF transmitter on the roof of the K building back in 1923. And then they also experimented with a couple of other things, including a blimp. Okay, that I thought maybe this was an advertising thing, but no, it was to haul up an antenna 1,500 feet up, and it was a 500-foot antenna, and they were using that for the HF transmissions to get broader coverage. Ultimately, KDKA was broadcasting coast to coast, and in some cases they were able to be heard over in Europe. Okay, so it was a little bit bigger than just one station at that point. So what is KDKA today? It's a news radio station. It's 1020. It's still a pretty strong Class A clear channel radio station broadcasting at 1020 kilohertz. In November 2nd, the same 100 years after they started simultaneous broadcasts on FM transmission at 100.1 megahertz, 100-year anniversary. Okay, it was pretty cool. It features news talk format operating on a transmitter power of about 50,000 watts today. Who has ever heard KDKA on the radio? Bunch of hands go up. Okay. Because its broadcast power is still strong enough in the evenings to be heard pretty much across the entire Northeast here. So, in any case, that pretty much wraps up. Oh, got to make my references. Okay, I had a lot of help with this. An important reference was this paper that Brian Belanger made me aware of out of the Antique Wireless Review. Dave and Julia Bart put together a really fantastic article about KDKA. Brian himself had wrote some articles in Dials and Channels. That's the newsletter out of the National Capital Radio and TV Museum, and then a whole bunch of other references. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed a little background and history on KDKA, and this is what really started what we do on a daily basis, collect radios, antique radios. So, folks, thank you very much.
When you got that radio at auction, did you know what you got?
You know, I wouldn't have known, except Brian pointed it out, this is called an RC, okay? Westinghouse RC, which is really an RA receiver, and this has no tubes in it, but the amplifier is the the DA, and that has tubes. Initially, they were sold as separate units, and then they decided to put them together and created the RC radio. And they stopped production on that in 1922. It was interesting because Westinghouse ended up joining RCA, and they were still selling radios on their own while they were part of RCA, which is like, what? Okay. But anyway, ultimately RCA took over that whole, and then Westinghouse and General Electric built radios. Or we saw that in one of, I think Paul Hart talked about that today. When RCA started, essentially all the teammates ended up building stuff for RCA, and interesting. As at Kutztown, this had tubes in it when I got it. It's not functional, but they weren't the right tubes. But I found the right ones in Kutztown. Okay, so yeah. Okay. Any other questions, folks? Thank you very much. Appreciate it. You know, all I was a sailor for 10 years. Why do I have shipwrecks on it? I don't know.
It's because you went dead with a sailor.
It's what I don't want to do. How's that?
So thank you, Dave. It was really interesting, and I really liked the pictures and not having to read a lot of text, as you said. So that ends our festivities for this evening. Remember, the old equipment contest is still. The old equipment from the contest is still on display next door. If you have something there, please take it home with you tonight, because we need to set up the room for the auction tomorrow. And our activities start tomorrow with a walk-around auction in the parking lot at 8:30. Jeff will be up there bright and bushy-tailed. And then Ed's presentation will start, let me double check the time, at, I'm not going to guess.
9:30.
See, somebody helps me all the time. At 9:30, Ed's repair clinic. The auction consignment next door starts at 8:30. Get everything in by 11:30. And the auction will start at 12 o'clock. And the raffle drawing will be at the beginning of the auction. And you can still buy some tickets for the raffle. So thank you very much for being here tonight, and we'll have more fun tomorrow. Good night.